So this is a video that I've debated many times on if I should do, because it's a topic that I think a lot of people don't want to talk about, but it's important. And that's that Monster Hunter Wilds has a huge problem. And that problem is its content. And how if we look at Capcom's track record and the history of Monster Hunter, it's kind of safe to assume that the game will release either light on content or even partially unfinished. And that's basing it off the history. That might not be the case, but I think it's the safer assumption to make, and there is a lot of newer Monster Hunter fans that might not be expecting the game to be like that, especially people who joined later on in World's life cycle, and a lot of people who skipped Rise. We have to talk about how Monster Hunter now is a live service game, and Wilds very probably will double down on its post-release content timeline, and some people might not like that. And in the current climate of very extreme reactions to things, people will look at Monster Hunter Wilds on release and say that Capcom is giving them an unfinished game and promising to finish it later. And that's all fine and dandy, that's how the internet works. I'm doing this because I want you to have your expectations in check. And these are not pie-in-the-sky speculations or doom posting. I'm basing this off of all of the data we have of the entire history of Monster Hunter and how the franchise has worked and where it's trending towards. And once again, let me repeat it, this might not be the case in the end, but it is the most probable one. Now, saying that Monster Hunter historically, including World and Rise, has released light on content is very subjective. Some people will tell you that they think that the content is fine and that the games are very full-featured, and I think that you should evaluate on a case-by-case basis. Hey there, sorry, Editing Mug here. I just wanted to clarify on that live service statement, since some people consider live services differently. Some people think that it's only if they have season passes, for example. For me, the definition of a live service is a game that, when you look at it compared to its 1.0 release, the version that you could get on a physical disc if you buy it, versus the version that exists after a series of updates, are fundamentally different. And as you'll see later on in the video, from all sorts of things, be that just very basic things like layered armor and layered weapons, or the total number of skills available, the abilities, the total number of monsters, locations, even endgame mechanics, Monster Hunter World and Rise both fit that definition for me. They are very different in their final patched versions than they are if you put in a 1.0 version of the games right now. And you can disagree with that, give it a different name, but I think you can't disagree with just how radically different the games are from launch to their final forms, and whether you consider that a net benefit or you see it more on the side of these are things that should be there at launch, that's a different question entirely. Again, this video is just to make sure people understand that these games change a lot from their launch versions. But there are certain things that are factual, and it's the fact that the games have felt less and less complete as time goes on, and that there is always the same pattern of the base game feeling more or less lacking in some areas, with the general fan base liking them, loving them. I think the Monster Hunter fan base loves the game so much that we tend to be very forgiving with them, and then we live off of hopium for the G-Rank expansion. That's more or less how it's always worked. But on top of that classic system of waiting for the expansions, World and Rise, taking advantage of, the modern internet era, have also supplemented that by adding these timelines of content updates that sometimes feel like Capcom is finishing up the game and really filling out all of the gaps that they have in content, and with Rise, that's just directly finishing the game. Rise is a game that was not finished when it released. That is not subjective opinion. That is, Capcom said that the game wasn't finished and they would be introducing the ending to the game in a patch. And even though a lot of people started playing with Monster Hunter World even within launch window, 10 million sales in the first 6 months, the game has sold 25 million copies, which means that 15 million people have, at the very minimum, experienced the game after some very important updates were introduced to it, and they don't remember the launch experience. Heck, even I, who played it at launch, can't tell you how the launch experience was. And as a side note, I'm going to show you just how many transformative updates were introduced. I'm going to talk about some of the problems that these games had at launch, and doing so was not easy to do. It feels like the information of the launch versions of these games is buried. If you go to wikis, if you search for information on them, you won't find much, and a lot of the information that is out there is fuzzy. It's people remembering things. I had to first find and then dig through official patch notes from Capcom to really determine what was added post-launch and really determine how the game was at launch. And even then, I found inconsistencies within Capcom's patch notes that don't really clarify when certain things were introduced. There is no wiki where there's like, hey, this is the monster list of Monster Hunter World and everything that was added post-launch has an asterisk or something. No, if you look for it, it looks like the game was always the way it was at its final update. And another thing to remark, and why this is so important for Wilds, is that it's not just World or Rise. Historically, when Monster Hunter has had a big shift in gameplay mechanics, and especially when they shifted to console graphics, to high-res graphics with Monster Hunter Tri on the Wii, that game had 17 monsters at launch and did not feel very content-rich, even though we all loved it at the time. And Monster Hunter Wilds, while it shares an engine with Monster Hunter Rise, seems to have significant gameplay changes. We would expect it being a next-generation Monster Hunter game, and of course, a significant graphical leap compared to the other game in the same engine being Rise, which is another point for us to expect lowered amounts of content. But let's take a look at that live service structure, just how transformative it was. Monster Hunter World released with 26 monsters, and it's not just that that might be a low number or a high number depending on your opinion, it's also the fact that World was designed to be a jumping on point for a lot of new players, and that definitely worked. But because of that, there's also a lot of monsters in World that feel kind of like training wheels, and if we're talking about the endgame loop of the game, the final monsters that you hunt and the gear that you want to craft and your options at endgame, it was specifically lacking in that. And if you search on Google and put answers for around when Monster Hunter World launched for opinions, you will see that opinion on the internet. Even if there are 26 monsters, there's a lot of them that are kind of one and done affairs that you really don't care that much about. And I also know that a lot of people just play these games to go through the story and they don't care about the endgame loop. But it is very important to the games whether it exists or not, and whether you engage with it or not is a separate thing. So yes, 26 monsters, but you gotta remember the great Jagresses, and the Juratotus, and the Paulumus, God, Paulumu, and the Pukes. You know, not everything here was a winner, not because those monsters are not very well designed, but because of what they actually add in playing the game for hours and hours and grinding. A while after release, we got Devil Joe. About a month after, 2 months after, we got Kove Taroth. 3 months in, we got Lunastra, and then they started introducing more arch-tempered monsters. Specifically, Valhazak and Teostra got their arch-tempered versions, which are kind of variants. They're not true variants. They are, you know, stronger versions, but still, those are walls for you to face and then loop into grinding and getting stronger to overcome those challenges, so that's good. Then we got Behemoth with the Final Fantasy XIV collaboration, as well as the ultra-wide and high-res textures for PC. Then we got arch-tempered Kushala Daora and Lunastra, and then a year after release, we got arch-tempered Kove Taroth, Leshen, and Ancient Leshen. And Kove Taroth, both in its first release and in its arch-tempered form, are really important parts of the endgame loop. Leshen and Ancient Leshen, by the way, when you look at stuff like the number of monsters, are counted as 2 different monsters. That is the Witcher 3 collaboration, by the way. And it's important to remark that with each of these updates, it's not just that they're bringing in new monsters. It's not just that there is a new challenge to face and to prepare for and a motivation to grind and overcome it. It's that these come with new weapons and new gear that often introduces new skills that completely change some weapons' builds. And not just the build, but the playstyle of them. They really open up the game and add a lot of content with each thing that comes into the game. And it also expanded on a lot of that endgame decoration, hunting, and crafting, and gearing, and customization. But anyways, we move on to Iceborne's launch, and while Iceborne was a very good G-rank expansion in my opinion, you know, people don't like the Clutch Claw, I get it, but the amount of monsters that it brought, how beautiful the locale that it brought is, and the overall amount of content I think was well worth the wait, and something that people had been discussing right from launch, that the game felt like it was missing its G-rank expansion, and hopefully it wouldn't disappoint. And I think overall, it didn't really disappoint that much. I think it was more controversial than disappointing. But Iceborne itself also had a lot of very important updates because the endgame loop of Iceborne wasn't really there. So the first update to Iceborne brought Rajang and the volcanic region for the Guiding Lands. Update number 2 brought Stygian Zinogre and Safi Jiva, as well as the Tundra region. Update 3 brought Furious Rajang and Raging Brachydios. It also brought things like layered weapons, which we didn't have before, as well as, again, it's always coming with more mechanics, more systems, more skills to unlock and focus on and prioritize for different builds, all of these things. Update number 4 brought Alatreon. Some people say Alatreon, but I don't know, I say Alatreon. And Frostfang Barrier. And update number 5 was Fatalis. Especially update number 2, when bringing in Safi Jiva, which is a really big part of the endgame gearing of Iceborne. It wasn't there at launch, it wasn't even there at the first patch. This is the trend I'm talking about. I'm not saying that we are disappointed with the amount of content at release, but there are cracks. You can see how a lot of these systems and things that most people interact with later on are not there at launch. We have to wait for those updates. And the big thing I'm trying to convey in this video is that a lot of people aren't aware of that. So when Wilds releases and has something similar, a lot of people are just going to be angry. Rise released with 32 monsters, which is a healthier number than the 26 of World, but also offset by the fact, pretty much the same one, that a lot of the early game in Rise, basically your first entire playthrough of low rank and part of the high rank, are incredibly easy. But more important than that is the fact that Rise was, as I said, unfinished. There was no ending to the story, and this is a part of the patch notes that has just been eliminated. I don't even think Narwa, which was the original final boss of the game, was there on launch day. It could have been, it might not have been. But from there, we actually got those endgame systems so that we could farm decorations, keep grinding and grinding and grinding, and then we got different updates. Update number 1 introduced actual hunts against monsters that were previously exclusive to the Rampage, being Apex Arzuros, Mizitsune, and Rathian. And again, these are walls, these are challenges. This is good, even if they're just, you know, stronger versions of existing monsters. Update number 2, though, brought Chameleos, Teostra, and Kushala Daora. This was the Elder Dragon update. This was about a month and a half or 2 months after launch. Pretty big, meaty update to introduce 3 Elder Dragons. And then from there, we got Apex Rathalos and Apex Diablos, which Apex Diablos I remember being quite good for just being an Apex fight. After that, we got Crimson Glow Valstrax and Apex Zinogre. And if I'm not mistaken, it's either on this patch or the next patch, we got the actual ending to the storyline. Finally, we got the final boss fight at this point. But with each of these updates, again, we got new skills that a lot of people expected to be there for what are more robust customization options in your loadouts. Actual different reasons to hunt different monsters, to craft different gear, to build out different potential builds for each weapon that are not really there at launch, and that is an important part to a lot of people of the Monster Hunter game. Sunbreak, just as much, came out and was a pretty good G-Rank expansion. I'm a very big fan of Rise. I am very aware that a lot of people do not like Monster Hunter Rise, and I'm very aware that some people are even telling me right now, they already typed a comment below saying that Rise isn't a real Monster Hunter game. Why would I even consider it one? Why would I base what Wilds will or won't do in terms of content with how Rise did it? And let me just tell you something. If you think that Capcom made Rise a game that sold almost as well, like very close to as much as Monster Hunter World, despite being on one console, being the Nintendo console, versus the 3 platforms that Monster Hunter World had, and they thought of it as a lesser game, or they put in less work into that game, you are sorely mistaken. They understand that the portable series is very important, especially to their audience in Japan, the most die-hard fans. It's a cultural thing. People play on trains over there, and they put in a ton of effort into it. We don't even know today what is the division of the teams for Monster Hunter and how much they share with each other different staff and ideas and technology to make their games work. We would hope that a lot, considering that Rise is on the same engine, and they should be able to take advantage of a lot of the elements of Rise in order to make the development of Wilds go smoother. It's a Capcom game. It's a full-price game that sold gangbusters, that is important to the franchise, and that when it comes to their trends in development and how they dole out content, they are definitely looking at the reception of it. So you better hope that they're paying attention and that they understand the backlash against how Rise was unfinished and they don't do it again. Anyways, Sunbreak would release and be a really good G-Rank expansion, but it wouldn't have its endgame mechanics in it. It had the anomaly investigations, which was meant to be the endgame loop, but it really wasn't fleshed out at all. There were no real reasons to do it very much until we got the introduction of curio crafting, or curious crafting, depending on how you want to call it. Once that was introduced, we really got a taste of what endgame was and what the loop was. There's a lot of good and bad that comes with the innovations that it applies to endgame. I think that the greatest strength of Rise's endgame is that it really gives you a reason to hunt every single monster in the game, which is really good, but it does come with some negatives as well. But that wasn't introduced until later. Update number 1 gave us Lucent Nargacuga, Seething Basil Juice, Gold Rathian, and Silver Rathalos, which I think is important to distinguish from something like Arch-Tempered or something like the Apex monsters, because the variants tend to be much different than their base versions, and some of my favorite monsters and favorite fights in the series are against variants of monsters I specifically like a lot, all of the ones introduced in Sunbreak. Update number 2 brought Flaming Espinus, Violet Misutsune, and Risen Chameleos. All 3 of those are great fights. The next update brought Chaotic Gora Magala, Risen Kushala, and Risen Teostra. Again, great fights. But with each of these, we got more anomaly investigations, more curio crafting, more flexibility with decorations, new skills added into the game, and new ways to take advantage of them. The next update brought Velkhana and Risen Crimson Glow Valstrax. The next update, pretty big one, had Amatsu and Risen Shigaru Magala, as well as Curious Melding, really signifying that, hey, we're adding some more quality of life features towards building out your ideal loadouts, and Primordial Malzeno. That is a lot of content and significant transformative content that makes Sunbreak 1.0 versus Final Sunbreak very different. And just like with Monster Hunter World, if you played Rise at launch versus 6 months later, it was a radically different game. If you played Rise when it came to PC with Sunbreak, you played a radically different game. If you played Sunbreak at launch versus Sunbreak in the last patch, those are very, very different games. And depending on who you ask, they are the finished versions of the game. It's no longer just additional content that makes us happy because, hey, it's free bonus content. Many times, it feels like they are adding things that should have been there from day one. There is that saving grace I mentioned of Rise and Wilds sharing an engine, by the way, because I want Wilds to succeed. I am a huge Monster Hunter fan, in case it's not clear. And if they can repurpose and use a lot of the work done in the RE engine for all of the monsters that are available in Monster Hunter Rise, we could get a pretty hefty amount of monsters and content available within the release of Wilds. If they can use those rigs and those models and just touch them up, put them up to speed graphically, and make them work with the new mechanics, you know, use them as a base to jump off of, I'm sure that would remove a lot of the very hard initial work that they did, for example, on World, where they had to redo most of everything because of the dramatic changes in the graphical engine and in the engine in general. But I wouldn't hold my breath, because that could very easily be offset by whatever changes are there in gameplay, whether it's the open world system or if it's not open world, but the dynamic weather systems and how those things affect monsters or whatever they're cooking up. That could just directly offset that reuse. But at the end of the day, I keep coming back to the same thought, which is this game is just not going to be that rich in content when it launches. It's going to probably be amazing and we're going to love the locales. It's going to be a bit of a repeat of Monster Hunter World's launch. And I hope that's not the case. I would love for Monster Hunter Wilds to surprise everybody. It actually includes G-Rank at launch. It has 75 monsters and robust endgame systems. It has 400 hours of content out of the box. It's just that I don't think that's realistic. I think it's much more realistic to expect it to be designed around post-launch support that continues adding more and more content. Even if there is no real incentive for it, they're not charging you for it, they're not gaining more money by having you hooked on playing the game or something, It's just a fact of development that they couldn't get everything done in time because that's what they seem to be getting used to in the last 6, almost 7 years. So I think that the best we can hope for is for the game to be pretty good in terms of content at launch and for it to have a pretty tight and significant post-launch support in that timeline. While some people, like I've said, will naturally criticize the game if that's the case, a lot of people will say that Capcom has released an unfinished game. A lot of people will piggyback off of the negative reception towards Dragon's Dogma 2 and say that Capcom is ruined or something. The fact is that they're not following any industry trends. They're following their own trends. They've released games like this using this model twice. And to all of the people that are going to say that I can't base what Wilds will be off of that, yeah, call me crazy for expecting a company to do the same thing that they've done twice. It's not even like I'm criticizing them necessarily for it. I actually think that Monster Hunter kind of works really well in this more MMO structure where as you play the game every 2 weeks, 3 weeks, month or so, you get a big content drop that gives you a reason to come back into the game and play it for 30 or 40 hours to grind new gear and try out new builds and new weapons and do new things and really catch up with where the current endgame point is and then be prepped for the next big content release. There's something fun in having everybody play the game. Some people stay, some people go, but we all come back every time there's a big update and keep playing, and the lifespan of the game and the reasons to keep playing and be excited for it are always there. It's weird to say because I don't like live service models, but this isn't trying to nickel and dime you. This is just them releasing a game that isn't really all the way cooked, you could say, and they just follow this model and finishing the dish, I guess. But all of those people that I've been talking about throughout this video that do exist, I'm sure, please let me know in the comments that you exist, that don't really know how the launch experience of a Monster Hunter game is, might find themselves disappointed. And I anticipate a torrent of negative feedback of saying that Monster Hunter Wilds just isn't finished or that Capcom is washed or something like that. And a lot of people following that trend without being properly informed of how it works. And this is not the Capcom Defense Squad, by the way. I don't, like I said, not the biggest fan of live service games, and we will evaluate how severe or not the issues are or if they even exist once the game is out. My ultimate goal here is for you to understand what you might be getting yourself into, to look at it carefully and have your expectations in check, and possibly what to look out for when looking at the pre-release coverage and previews and interviews around Wilds. I started playing with Monster Hunter Tri, and Portable 3rd and 3 Ultimate were very content rich, and 4 was the best game in terms of overall content in its release. So going from 4 to 4 Ultimate was still great for me. And Generations being an anniversary game, like a collection of all of the previous games, a best of, both it and Ultimate has, I think, 93 large monsters in it. It felt like content just kept going up with some exceptions, right? Like the numbers are something like 17 to 54 to 74 to 54 to 75 to 77 to 93. Just talking about monsters as an easy barometer. Again, monster number is not the end-all be-all. It's a lot about systems as well. But going from that progression to World with 26 monsters, many of them not really that cool and feeling kind of empty in the endgame, did feel disappointing to me and to a lot of people. And I think there's going to be a whole new generation of people that started with World or with Rise or wasn't there at launch to experience those games that are expecting 70 monsters, that are expecting all of these robust endgame systems. And they're going to jump into Wilds with 25 monsters and be like, what is this? And even if you end up loving the game, there is an initial reaction of, damn, I finished this game already? What else is there to do? And then looking online, and Capcom has announced the timeline of post-launch support and having that bit of disappointment. And I think that in the end, I just want people to enjoy video games. So I'd rather you know that. You know that that's a very real, very well-reasoned possibility here, and have that in mind. I expect that, like all of my Monster Hunter videos, I just expose myself to a large amount of hatred and very visceral comments. Let's say a lot of hidden comments. And no, I do not do this for clout or money. The $5 that I'm going to make off of this video do not compensate the amount of hatred I am going to receive. And I'm saying all of this because if you made it all the way to the end of the video and you think that this is a valuable message to remind people of, hit the like button, leave a nice comment, leave a sensible comment, engage down there. It's good for the algorithm and it's good for my mental health. I'm asking you that if you liked this video, say something nice to offset the amount of negativity that I see very often these days in a lot of the Monster Hunter community and how divided it can be at times. If you want more essays and opinions and things on video games, you can subscribe. And if you're not sure yet, you can check out the channel. Check out some videos. I recommend my long form playlist. Thank you to my wonderful patrons for supporting me. And if you want to support me, the link is in the description. There is only one tier for my patron and it's $1. Gets you up on the wall and a verbal shout out at the end of the long form videos. To everybody else, thank you so much for watching. I've been Mug Thief, and I'll see you again very soon.